My name is Jason Cormier. I'm the founder, editor, and so far sole contributor to OddBike.com. I was working in the jewelry industry in Montreal at the time, and it was the middle of the winter, November 2012, and I was bored at work. Things were slow. Economy wasn't doing too hot in Montreal at the time, and didn't have a lot of customers. So I was sitting at work one day, one afternoon, and I just had this idea that I wanted to write about weird motorcycles. And the the whole thing started with a list. So the list was just a Word file, and I just sat down in the shop that day on my laptop, and I just hammered out a list of all the weirdest bikes that I knew of, the like rare machines, unusual machines, machines that had like kind of cool historical provenance, um, and the the list grew. It probably had about 20 or 30 entries on it, and I was looking over it, and I was like, a lot of these things I think are really interesting, and I don't know a lot about them, and I'd like to know more. So it started with that list, and the I think the first bike that I did was the Bimota V2A, which I always find it fascinating because it was such a spectacular failure for Bimota, and it was after a huge amount of hype, and that this was like the second coming of two-stroke motorcycles, and like this was going to save the two-stroke, and it was going to revolutionize sport bikes, and blah blah blah. It ended up being a complete disaster for the company for various reasons. And so that was the first article that I started working on. So I started working on this article. I threw together a website quickly on Blogger. I did some like basic design work. I even put together my own logo at that point. The logo that I use today just came out of that, just kind of an afternoon screwing around on Photoshop. First article that I published was the Bimota article, and then I kind of quickly started doing others and going through my list. The first probably 10 or 15 articles that I did were straight off of the list that I did that afternoon in November. And I sort of realized, like, this is really fun. I was never satisfied with the quality of the writing and the research, and in particular the technical detail was something that I always had issue with. And reason being is that, by training and education, I'm a historian, but by experience, I'd consider myself sort of a advanced shade tree mechanic. I've worked as a mechanic in Montreal. Funny enough, in Quebec, you don't actually have to be licensed to be a mechanic. So I worked several summers as a motorcycle mechanic at a tiny shop that was about 30 years out of date, and I worked on British bikes. We sold new Triumphs, and we also serviced and restored Nortons, BSAs, Enfields, all the old British crap. Learned to hate them very quickly, but learned a lot. And then I just played around with my own bikes over the years and just learned as I went along. I am a self-taught mechanic. And so with that background, I had an understanding of mechanics and of the technical side of motorcycles. And that was something that I found extremely fascinating. And the stranger the engineering and the design, the better. And that was something that really inspired the concept of OddBike, was that, well, I don't care about sort of ordinary run-of-the-mill, like typical bikes, and I find it really interesting that there are this small collection of bikes out there that have done these really wild engineering ideas, or have these really wild designs and really interesting construction, and sort of left field ideas coming together to make these really extraordinary machines that are so far away from the norm that they're sort of their own category, and it's like a divergent evolution of the machine, where you have the production stuff that's very follows a mold and follows a lot of the same ideas and is just an evolution of basic principles that have been established for decades, if not 100 years. And then you have these other guys that are doing these really kind of unusual things that maybe aren't better than the boring traditional stuff, but the fact that they were doing it and the fact that they were trying it really impressed me and really made me respect these individuals, these guys, these women that were behind these things. And from that, I kind of got a reputation for speaking my mind and being brutally honest. And to me, it was just sort of being me. I mean, from the beginning, OddBike I considered just a personal venue. It was just a place where I was writing about what I thought was interesting and sharing my opinions. And it wasn't really to appeal to a mass market. It was just something to do because I was bored at work, and I was just like clawing my eyes out and needed something to do and something to keep me engaged over a long Canadian winter. And it surprised me in how popular it suddenly became. And I had people coming to me and emailing me or making comments and saying how great it was and how it's some of the best writing they'd ever read about motorcycles. And I was just like completely floored by it, because I didn't think I was that good, and I just didn't even think that my research was that good. But I was just digging up information on these bikes and putting them together in a way that hadn't really been done before, and it was all really very accidental. The pieces sort of fell into place in a way that I ended up with something that was a really cool niche that I enjoyed covering and that nobody else was really doing, or at least not doing well. From that into 2013, so in the first year that I was doing OddBike, I got some offers to meet people and to come down and see projects and see firsthand what was going on in kind of this independent bubble inside the motorcycle industry that was outside of the norm, or outside of the major manufacturers. And one of the main guys that I met through that, and because he started commenting on my website and then he emailed me after, was JT Nesbitt. And JT is perhaps infamous for working for Confederate and really establishing the Confederate design as we know it today. Until JT came along, Confederate was basically using Harley clone motors in a sporty, stiff chassis with good suspension and brakes. So it was a power cruiser before power cruisers or muscle bikes were really a big thing. They were starting in the mid to late 90s. They were making these bikes with a very small clientele and high price tags. But outwardly, and from 50 feet away, they kind of looked like a Harley. They had a big twin engine and sort of traditional styling. They had nice components, nice wheels, nice brakes, nice suspension. The frames were really good, developed by Cormier Engineering. The engines were hot rod engines. They weren't, traditional big twins that you'd get out of a box stock Harley. And JT came into that company loving what they were doing and reviewing their bikes in a magazine, which I think was Iron Horse, if I remember correctly. And he came into the company and sort of fought his way into the design side of it, and he developed the Hellcat. And the Hellcat was absolutely groundbreaking. I mean, it was what established Confederate as the crazy American darling of celebrities motorcycle company, making these really amazing, like titanium carbon fiber laden wild designs that just didn't look like anything else out there. To have him come along and say, I like what you're doing, was a shock and a really pleasant surprise. So in 2013, at his urging, I decided to make a plan to go down to Alabama and New Orleans and Louisiana, and ostensibly it was to go to the Barber Vintage Festival at the Barber Motorsports Museum in Birmingham, Alabama, or outside of Birmingham, Alabama. And then following the event, I would take a couple of days to go down to Louisiana and stay with JT in New Orleans and have a look at his latest design, which at that point he was working on the Bienville Legacy. And his company was an independent studio that he called Bienville Studios, and he was based in the French Quarter. And so I formulated this plan to, okay, I'm going to do this trip. And I don't want to just fly down. Like, I want to do something fun. So I decided to ride down. And if you've followed the site for any amount of time, you'll know that my only motorcycle is a 1997 Ducati 916. So the plan was to ride the 916 from Montreal to New Orleans, spend 2 weeks on the road, doing about 4,000 miles, and it ended up being an amazing experience, one of my life-defining experiences. Just the people that I met, the things that I saw, the events that I was a part of were just astonishing. I went to the Barber Vintage Festival, had a great time, met the guys at Modus when they were just kind of starting up their factory. They hadn't yet gotten any production bikes together. They were just working on prototypes. And at the Modus event was where I met JT, because JT was unveiling the Bienville Legacy, because the Bienville Legacy uses a Modus engine. And so I went down to New Orleans and I met up with JT there, and I stayed with him at the studios, and went out with him and just got blind drunk and just philosophized about motorcycling and what OddBike was about and where was OddBike going and what could it be and what is it. And JT gave me a lot of insight into what I was doing and what I could potentially be doing. And it really kind of cemented in my mind that, okay, this is something special and I need to cultivate it, and I need to work on it, and I need to make this the best that I can make it. Yeah, and he sort of presented what I was doing as something more important than I ever conceived of it. That what I was doing was really valuable and was really well respected, and at least he really respected it and he really appreciated it, and it gave me that kick in the ass that I sort of needed at that point to expand and put more effort into it and do a better job of and expand the scope of OddBike and try to get it to more people. So that was really where the site took off, was following that trip to Louisiana, to Alabama, and everywhere else along the way. We as motorcyclists can be very traditional and very conservative, and we can often disregard anything that doesn't fit our sort of narrow viewpoint of what a motorcycle should be. And I like to call it the not in my garage attitude, where anybody that has an opinion against a bike generally will say that they wouldn't buy it and thus it has no reason to exist, which I absolutely despise. I think that even the worst motorcycles have a right to exist, and weird ideas have a right to exist, and we should be pushing the envelope more and more and innovating more. Whether it works or not is kind of irrelevant, and whether you like it or not is totally irrelevant. I think that if we as motorcyclists are going to move forward in this industry, we need to be more open to these weird ideas and alternative designs and alternative thinking. You have stuff like the Brittens V1000 that has just captured the hearts and minds of millions of people, and everything that the Brittens V1000 and John Britten's work and the people that worked with John Britten, everything that represents is what I want to cultivate. And I think that there's a lot of bikes out there that are, if not equally deserving of admiration, at least should be acknowledged as innovative and cool and amazing in their own right. I think that the current difficulties faced by the motorcycle industry with a dying baby boomer market and a youth market that isn't really adopting motorcycling in the same way as previous generations, it's something that I find very hard to reconcile with, because I'm 32, and I guess I'm a millennial. I would be considered one, maybe an early millennial. And nobody's asking my opinion on why the industry is floundering, or if I have any solutions to the problem. And all of the analyses that I have seen have completely ignored the basic fact that we can't afford motorcycles anymore. It's that simple. It's that my generation, let's say, teens, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, we can't afford motorcycles anymore. I can't hope to go into a showroom and spend $15,000, $20,000 on some bike, and then if I was a new rider, to go and then spend $5,000, perhaps more dollars a year on insurance, and then risk my license every time I go out on the road because of law enforcement presence and speed cameras that will ticket me $500 for even daring to creep over the speed limit, or losing my license if I do any unreasonable speed. The accessibility just isn't there like it used to be. And it's not because, we're, got our noses buried in our phones and we're on Facebook. That's complete bullshit. The problem is that we have too much debt, we're not making enough money, we can't spend that money on motorcycles and on this, we don't have the disposable income to spend on toys, and essentially that's what motorcycles are. I mean, there's a few of us diehards that find a way to spend the money and enjoy the sport, but for somebody who just wants to come into it at the ground level, it's really, really hard. It's a huge hurdle financially, and a lot of kids are just choosing not to. And it's not just in motorcycling, it's the same in cars. I mean, cars are ridiculously expensive, and insurance is expensive, so on and so forth. So to just dismiss it as like, these dumb kids, they just spend all their days on Facebook and on computers and they don't care about vehicles anymore. It's not that. And it's not because we all think that vehicles are bad and evil and gas is bad and evil. I mean, there's still some people out there that really enjoy mechanical things and really enjoy vehicles and really enjoy driving, but they're not walking into showrooms and buying new machines. If anything, they're buying used stuff and clapped out stuff and fixing up themselves. I mean, the whole hipster cafe racer genre should be enough indication of that. But the OEMs just seem to be completely have their blinders on and don't realize or don't want to acknowledge that the basic problem is affordability. And so some of the OEMs are starting to get it, but at the same time, they're still moving into the stratosphere with the halo models that they're really the core of their advertising and the core of what they think should be selling. So that's sport bikes, cruisers, tours, adventure bikes, all the shit that baby boomers have been floating along for years and years, and now are on a pretty steady decline because the baby boomers are getting too old to ride the damn things. Those are the things that the youth aren't going to buy. Like, I don't know any 18-year-old that aspires to buy a 600-pound R1200 GS and load it with $10,000 worth of stupid aluminum accessories so that he can putter around town. But I know plenty of baby boomers that is the be-all, end-all for them. So that market's dying, literally. the new market doesn't really see the appeal of what the companies are focusing on, and then the new riders, the new market, simply can't afford to join the club. If you've followed OddBike, you'll know that I am vehemently opposed to advertising and sponsorship, and there's good reason for that. Number one, I realized very quickly doing what I was doing that there was no money to be made through the traditional avenues, or what money could be made was an absolute pittance. I was getting paid something like $50 an article and then not seeing any results from it. Then I'd have to surrender the article to another site, and they would get all of the attention and the hits for it, and I would get zero once the $50 was spent. So I realized very quickly that it wasn't worth pursuing that, and that the traditional avenues, magazines, not so much books, they're kind of their own thing, but particularly magazines and the online presence of a lot of the magazines and the blogs, they're driven by advertising, they're driven by advertorial crap. And I made it a point to fight back against that and be honest and say what needed to be said, regardless of potential consequences or pissing anybody off. And I certainly have pissed off a lot of people over the years. But it allows me to be free to say what I want to say and write about what I want to write about. And that's probably the most important thing of what I'm doing. And it's not something I ever intend to give up. But there is one group that I am happy to be accountable to, and that is my followers, and that are the people that are reading my work. And I've only sought funding directly from them. In the past, it's been with Indiegogo, with campaigns. But now I'm moving into Patreon as a way of getting a more stable monthly income and funding for these projects. And that way I can maintain OddBike free of advertising and free of bullshit. And I'm happy to do that, because at the end of the day, this has never been about the money. I never intended to make money on this, and I still don't intend to make money on it, but I at least like to be able to cover my expenses and have the ability to take a little bit more time off and do more things, and maybe buy some better camera equipment if I'm going to do more videos, stuff like that. So I've developed a new list of people that I want to sit down with and I want to interview, and I want to present here on OddBike Stories on this YouTube channel. And I'm hoping that will be the next evolution of OddBike, but it's not in place of OddBike as it is today or has been in the past. I still will be writing, and I still want to write, and I still want to tell the stories, and I still have a backlog of bikes to cover and research to sift through and pictures to go through. So thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel, and visit the Patreon page, patreon.com/oddbike, to contribute to the site.